Goodwill for Kant is the only unconditional, absolute, unlimited good, as we found in the first paragraph of Kant's book last time. But what is goodwill? We're going to need a number of qualifications in order to make specific what Kant means by it. We have to go through several stages of Kant's argument in order to gradually get completely clear on what Kant means by goodwill. Kant writes, this may not be the single and entire good, but it must be the highest good, and the condition for all the rest, even of every demand for happiness. The goodwill is superior to happiness, and Kant is going to give us a more technical reason for that in a little while. But what I want you to notice is the implication of this. In my own words, it is that Kant wants us to do what's right because it's right, not because it will make us or anyone else happy. At the same time, Kant means something very precise by intentions, and it's not exactly what we ordinarily mean by the term. In the first paragraph of the book, Kant again has directed us toward the goodwill, and this is another word for good intentions. He's also told us that the only thing that counts as willing is mobilizing everything that is within our power. Everything else is merely a wish. But then Kant makes a surprising claim on page 15 that makes clear we will need to work hard to understand his point. The second proposition is this: an action from duty has its moral worth not in the aim that is supposed to be attained by it, but rather in the maxim according to which it is resolved upon. Thus, that worth depends not on the actuality of the object of the action, but merely on the principle of the volition in accordance with which the action is done without regard to any object of the faculty of desire. So it's intention over consequence. So the purpose is not aiming for a particular consequence. Aiming is about consequences. I'm aiming to make you happy, for example, or I'm aiming to be successful, or whatever I have as the intended consequences of my actions. But Kant wants us to understand that the ethical worth of an action does not depend upon its consequences, intended or otherwise. But Kant has a number of qualifications to this. The first is that the principle of our action must come from reason alone and not from experience. That's because the absolute, unconditioned, without limitation, that sort of thing never comes from experience. We only get relative truths out of experience. We only learn what happens for the most part, like Mill's actions tend to produce certain consequences. We could only get an absolute rule from reason itself by using logic, by using ideas. We have to understand what reason is for Kant if that's going to be the source of moral obligation. Reason for Kant is characterized by two features: universality and necessity. And by the way, they overlap. If you understand one of them, that's enough. Universality means that something applies at all places and all times to all persons. And Kant's going to have a specific definition, of course, of what a person is. Necessary means that something is always and everywhere the case. Those sound very similar to one another. We'll make a slight distinction a couple of videos from now. So you might be concerned that moral obligation is coming from reason, because what if you have a human being who's, let's say, too young to really be rational, to really understand moral obligation? What if you have someone who is intellectually disabled, who would not count that as a rational person? And I think we can let go of that worry, because Kant, in fact, has a very low bar for what counts as a rational being, what counts as rationality. So if we think about universality and necessity, a child reaches a certain point where that child understands that a table is a table, a shelf is a shelf. So for instance, a shelf is something that holds up books. And the child comes to understand that the shelf, the word shelf, is not the name of this particular shelf. It's a word that covers all possible objects in the universe or even in my imagination, right? In the world of possibilities. Everything that might hold up a book or a number of other objects, right? So we have universality the moment we're able to grasp that there are terms that apply everywhere and always. So if universality and necessity are the characteristics of reason, we can say that science is just rationality applied to nature, rationality in terms of universality and necessity applied to nature. And ethics is reason, that is universality and necessity, applied to action, right? Science is reason applied to nature, to understanding nature, and ethics is universality and necessity equals rationality applied to action, and specifically to the issue of moral obligation. On page 17, we find Kant articulating his highest moral principle for the first time. I ought never to conduct myself except so that I could also will that my maxim become a universal law. And on page 18, he states it in a positive way or in the form of a question. Can you will also that your maxim should become a universal law? So we can see, first of all, that Kant's highest principle of ethics is going to be a decision procedure in the form of a question. If I want to know whether the rule I'm thinking of acting according to, the maxim, we'll come back to that term, is ethical or unethical, Kant wants me to ask myself this question: can I will that my maxim should become a universal law? But what does that question mean exactly? It's very important to understand that what Kant is writing about here is a thought experiment, a hypothetical he's asking us to run, and it involves imagining a world where everyone follows the same rule that I'm proposing to follow myself with regard to a certain action. Kant wants us to first imagine such a world, and then he wants us to ask ourselves, would it be okay with you if you lived in that kind of world? Could you will that world? Could you consent to living in that world that was organized in that way? There's a really important implication of this that we don't want to miss. There is no such thing as the moral law for Kant. It isn't that God or some other superior being has come down and said, here is the moral law, follow it or I'll punish you. That's not Kant's picture. Instead, what we have for him is a way of thinking through our actions to determine whether we would be okay with making them into universal laws. In other words, Kant is saying, go ahead, play God for a minute and ask yourself if it would seem right to you to create a world where your subjective rule that you're considering acting according to right now becomes an objective rule, a rule that everyone else followed too. Okay, so we're getting the general idea, but to get a more specific idea of what Kant could mean by act always in such a way that the maxim of your action could be made into universal law, first we need to understand what a maxim is. We find the definition of a maxim first stated on page 16, and then later on page 34, a little more clearly, both times in a footnote. So sometimes it's very important to read the footnotes. So on page 16, a maxim is the subjective principle of the volition. Volition means willing here. The objective principle, that is that which would serve all rational beings, also subjectively as a practical principle, if reason had full control over the faculty of desire, is the practical law. Okay, it's a bit clearer, I think, on page 34. A maxim is the subjective principle for action. and must be distinguished from the objective principle, namely the practical law. The former, the maxim, contains the practical rule that reason determines in accordance with the conditions of the subject, that is, the individual, often its ignorance or its inclinations, biases, and is thus the principle in accordance with which the subject, the individual, acts, that is, actually acts. But the law is the objective principle valid for every rational being and the principle in accordance with which it ought to act. I like to say that a maxim is a personal policy. It can either be ethical or unethical. Now, there's a question we can ask that's very helpful in distinguishing Mill from Kant. And in fact, we're going to be able to ask this question with all four of our philosophers. And that is, what is this particular philosopher's unit of moral evaluation? Now, what do I mean by that? I can only really explain this by means of examples, but those of you who are in the sciences will understand exactly what I mean by unit of evaluation. So for Mill, what we're evaluating when we're asking, is X right or wrong, is a single action. So we say that a single action is Mill's unit of moral evaluation because that's what he's going to evaluate. Well, isn't that always what we evaluate from an ethical perspective? And the answer is no. Kant does not want to evaluate the individual action, right? What Kant wants to evaluate is a policy that covers a range of actions that could be undertaken under relevantly similar circumstances. Okay, that's what a maxim is, a personal policy that could cover a number of different actions that I might take under a certain set of circumstances. And then if we think about it, Kant doesn't say a lot about this in the book that we're reading. If we think about it, if we added up all of the maxims that a person lives by, all of the rules that I give myself for my action, if I add all of those up into a kind of system, I would have my character. You could read my character off of this system of maxims that I live by. Okay, so Kant's highest moral principle is not exactly stating an ethical value that we measure our actions by. That was Mill. Instead, Kant's highest moral principle is a procedure for testing maxims. Kant's highest ethical principle is a maxim testing procedure. In giving us his highest moral principle, Kant is trying to tell us how we should test a maxim in order to determine whether it is ethical or unethical.